Ready to rock and roll? Tonight we're going to be launching a new class, a new series, calling it Custom and Convention. So there are Minhagi Yisrael, there are customs of the Jewish people. Many of these are actually halachas and Shulchan Aruch. As per the Gemara's statement, Minig Yisrael Torahi, customs of Jewish people are actually Torah. And the question is, where did these minhagim come from? How important are they? What is it meaning? And how should it affect us in our lives? So I want to talk for a moment as a preface, before I address the specific minhag, the specific custom we're going to speak about this evening, which is called Parshat Shekalim, the notion that there are special Torah readings towards the end of the winter, just before spring arrives. I want to talk to you for a moment about the fact that the Jewish New Year actually starts twice. There's Rosh Hashanah, and that commemorates creation, or the creation of humanity. And we know that as the day Hashem judges us. We know that as the day that God renews our lease on life. And everybody knows you prepare for Rosh Hashanah. The whole month of Elul is a month of preparation. What many people do not realize is that there is another date on the calendar that is a Rosh Hashanah of sorts. And there is actually a month of preparation as well. And that's kind of a segue into today's class. Let me direct your attention towards a verse in the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verse 2. This is a verse that contains within it the very first mitzvah the Jewish people were given as a nation. And it was given to Moshe Rabbeinu on a specific date. God says, HaChodesh hazeh lochem Rosh Chodashim. This month is going to be for you the head of months. This is Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Moshe Rabbeinu is in Mitzrayim. We, the Jewish people, have not formally come into our own yet. We aren't yet circumcised. We haven't yet brought a Korban Pesach. We haven't been formally born as a nation. That takes place on Pesach, but yet we're kind of still a nation already because we're getting mitzvahs. Moshe Rabbeinu is receiving mitzvahs on our behalf, and we're getting our first mitzvah, which is to sanctify time. So what does it mean? This Chodesh is for you Rosh Chodashim. We all know Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of the year. Like, this Jewish New Year is Rosh Hashanah. Everybody knows that. So first Rashi comes along and he says that HaChodesh Hazeh, it's more like HaChidush Hazeh. It's this rebirth, it's this novelty. Rashi tells us, Her'ohu Levana B'chidusha. God showed Moses the new moon as it was reappearing, a sliver of the moon, and God said to him, this will be for you Rosh Chodesh. However, Rashi says, I cannot misconstrue the verse from its literal meaning. Ein mikra yotze midei pshutei. There is still the straightforward meaning. And the straightforward meaning is, Al Chodesh Nisan Omerlo. God said this to Moses, not about Rosh Hashanah, not about the month of Tishrei, but the month we call Nisan. And he said, Zeh hihi alochem l'seder minyan hachadashim. This will be for you for the order of months. And the order of months means that Nisan is the first month, Sheyehei Iyar Korei Sheni, Iyar will be called the second month, Sivan will be called Shlishi, the third month, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, as the Be'er Mayim Chaim explains Rashi's words, when we say that this will be L'Seder Minyan HaChadashim, that even though this month isn't at the beginning of the year, and we all know that the year begins in Tishrei, as it says in this very book, in a few chapters from now, that Chag HaOsif is B'tzeis Hashana, that you gather or bring all of the produce into the home at the end of the year. You kind of bring all the work of the year, bring it in, and then the winter comes. That's the beginning of the year then. That's where the year kind of begins and ends. Nonetheless, says the Be'er Mechayim, Timnu min Nisan minyan seder chadashim. You'll count months from this point and onward. And we're going to talk about this at great length later on, Bezrat Hashem, when we get to the fourth special reading, which is called Parshas HaChodesh. But I just wanted to point out to you that Rosh Chodesh Nisan is a big day on the Jewish calendar. It's the day we got our first mitzvah. And God himself tells Moses, from this day and onward, from this Rosh Chodesh and onward, you'll begin to count. And during the first temple era, from the time of Moses, all the way until after the story of Purim, we used to refer to months, not by name, but rather the way we refer to days. Yom Rishon, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi, only Shabbat has a name. That's how we refer to months. Chodesh HaRishon, Chodesh HaSheni, Chodesh HaShlishi, first month, second month, third month, fourth month, etc. Exactly a year later, on this very day, God speaks to Moses again. And what happens on this very day, this first anniversary of us, in a sense, getting our first mitzvah? If you go to the end of the book, Exodus 40, the 17th verse, it's the 6th reading of Parshas Pekudei, which is at the very end of the book. It says, Vayehi, and it was, B'chodesh harishon, on the first month. So now we have this month being identified. Bashana hashenis, in the second year. So we're counting year 2 of our peoplehood from the first day of the month. Be'echad lachodesh, on the first day of the month. What happened? Hukam HaMishkan. God's mobile home was formally established. In other words, on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, God gave us our first mitzvah. Exactly a year later, on this anniversary, God dwelt with us. He moved in with us. He was going to live together with the Jewish people. His presence would be with us in a manifest way. So this date is spoken of twice in the book of Exodus. 1 year after the next. Of course, later on in the book of Leviticus, this is the date that's called Yom HaShmini, the 8th day, because there are 7 days of preparation from the 23rd day of Adar until the end of the month. And then on the first day, which is the 8th day, first day of Nisan, that's when the Mishkan is put up and God's presence comes to the Jewish people. So the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, in the tractate called Shekalim, right in the beginning says about this verse, V'toni Allah, b'yoyim shehukam hamishkan. We learned about this on the day that the Mishkan was established. Bo bayom nitroma hatruma. On this day is when the donations were officially submitted. Which donations are these? These are the donations that we used to purchase the offerings. So now we all gave, in a sense, our forerunner of a shul membership, so to speak, of everybody participating equally, everybody giving half a silver shekel, and this half a silver shekel was inducted or taken and actualized, like spent. They started to use this new money on that day. The offering started to be brought.
The year when the Mishkan was started.
So that's like beginning of a year, right? So it's the beginning of a year for us getting our first mitzvah. It's the beginning of a year not only for us getting the Shekhinah, the presence of Hashem, but subsequent to that, this is the time that the new offerings began.
At the same time as the Mishkan?
Well, when the Mishkan was set up first, obviously that's when the offerings began. But the point that's being made here by the Talmud Yerushalmi is that this date remains the day in perpetuity that we establish the concept of the Mishkan on a regular basis, meaning the offerings are renewed. So every year we gather the money for the korbanot, we buy the korbanot, we offer the korbanot come to an end, and a new year begins, a new year of offerings. And this happens on an annual basis. And this is the reason that on the last month of the year, we have the statement that says you have to make a tumult. You have to call out and say, hey, it's time to bring in your shekalim. So, since this is a day, that's like a start, a new year, and incidentally, when we take the beginning of Masechet Rosh Hashanah and we read Arba Rosh Hashanah, there are 4 beginnings or 4 New Years. Guess what the first one is? Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Now there are 2 others, like there's the New Year of the Trees, which is somewhat known and observed, and there's the New Year of Rosh Chodesh Elul, which is hardly known or observed. The point is this: the 2 New Years, if you will, or 2 beginnings in which we have an annual cycle, are the first day of Tishrei, which we don't call Rosh Chodesh, we call that Rosh Hashanah, and the first day of Nisan. Now we all know we prepare for Rosh Hashanah 30 days before, blow the shofar a whole month, and we say special prayers. The Sephardic Jews say Selichot a whole month, and the Hasidic Yidden say special chapters of Tehillim a whole month. In the last week or so, or 10 days, they're saying Selichot, and we do all kinds of things to prepare for Rosh Hashanah. What do we do to prepare for this new beginning? And the answer is quite a bit. And that's where today's class kind of kicks in. So there's this idea that because the shekalim are going to be collected, because we're going to be bringing now the new funding and starting a new year of annual offerings, that the funds would have to be collected in the month prior. And indeed, the Gemara at Maseches Megillah tells us in the Mishnah that be'echad be'adar, on the first day of Adar, which is 30 days prior to Rosh Chodesh Nisan, mashmi'in al hashkalim, then we have to make an issue. We speak about the shkalim, and the Gemara in Maseches Megillah on page 29 says clearly, it's a Mishnah. It says that on the Shabbat of Rosh Chodesh Adar, koirim parsha shkalim, we read parsha shkalim. Now, what this does for us, this idea of reading Parshat Shekalim, let's just talk for a moment about the concept of Torah reading altogether. The notion of reading the Torah on a weekly basis in the shul is very old. It's about as old as Judaism itself. The Gemara in Maseches Bava Kama speaks about this being started in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu. Rambam says Moshe Rabbeinu established it. The Kesef Mishnah asks a question, how could it be that Moshe Rabbeinu established it? We have no evidence of that anywhere. And he says it must be that the Rambam understood that if Nevi Hadar, if the prophets in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu did this, they never would have done it without the approbation of Moshe. So whilst Moshe's name wasn't officially attached to it, but this was literally one of the first rabbinic injunctions going back 3,330 years. The thing is that what we read each Shabbat was not really set in stone. And for a long time, the Torah was read by different people in different places in different ways. Torah was read every week, but the concept that we know today of Parshat HaShavua was not established until a much, much later time. In fact, in the post-Second Temple era, where the shul rose to enormous prominence, as we had no more longer a Beis HaMikdash, even though there were shuls and services before, we had two cycles. In the land of Israel, people were completing the entire Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, over the course of 3 years. And Jews outside of Eretz Yisrael were doing it in 1 year. At some point during the time of the Gaonim, about 16 centuries ago or so, it kind of coalesced, and the minhag, the custom of finishing the Torah every 3 years, slowly faded, and all Jewish communities have been following Parshat HaShavua. We don't know of any Jewish community today, anywhere in the world, that reads the Torah otherwise. I mean, of course, those follow the Torah. All Torah communities have something called Parshat HaShavua. However, it seems very clear from the Mishnah that even older than Parshat HaShavua, if Rosh Chodesh Adar fell on Shabbat, or on the Shabbat prior to Rosh Chodesh Adar, that all communities would take out the Sefer Torah and read Parshat Shekalim. What is Parshat Shekalim? There's a dispute in the Gemara. Some say it's the Parshat Shekalim we have, speaking about the half shekel, and some say it's the offerings, the selection of the offerings in Parshas Pinchas that talk about Olat Chodesh Bechodsho, so that people know that there's regular offerings that have to be brought. The minhag universally today is we all read Parshat Kitisa, Parshat Shekalim. Now, the concept of Shekalim, these 4 parshiot, in a sense, herald the new year. The first thing we talked about is the shekels, because in 30 days from now, we have to make sure all the shekalim are already given. And the Bezdin needs time to get the word out and collect the shekalim. There's a dispute amongst our sages whether or not they started collecting from the time of Purim, before Purim historically. In the first Beis HaMikdash, they started collecting from midway through the month, or the collection began right at the beginning of the month. But at any rate, it's universally understood that from the beginning of Adar was always kind of Elul-like. Now, after the story of Purim, the primary theme of Adar became Purim. And V'nahapachu, transformation, and miracles, and beautiful things, and celebrations. But even prior to Purim, the concept of Adar was an important month. It was a month of preparation. We were ending the year and looking forward to starting a new one. And we began it with the reading of Parshat Shekalim, which emphasizes that each and every single member of Am Yisrael should be giving their shekel, their half shekel, so that come Rosh Chodesh Nisan, all of the half shekalim should already be in place, and then the korbanot that are going to be offered on a daily basis would be garnished from funds, or taken from funds, that everybody had contributed equally, so the korban was brought equally on everybody's behalf. Okay, that's very nice. So you're telling me during the time of the Beit HaMikdash, they used to have a Torah reading, and they called the Parshat Shekalim, and it was actually a very practical thing. We had to get in the mood, get ready for doing a big mitzvah. This mitzvah of our annual contribution to Beis HaMikdash services, to the Korbanot. What does it have to do with us today? Why are we reading Parshat Shekalim? We don't have korbanot. We don't have offerings. Why has this custom remained with the Jewish people when it would seem, in principle, that its value has simply faded away with the loss of the Beis HaMikdash? So the Sefer HaChinuch says, and it seems that Rashi and the Meiri follow the same opinion. I want to read to you what he says. He says, Va'achshav, and now he says, in the end of the 105th mitzvah, Ba'avonoseinu, in our sinful state, She'ein lanu migdash, we no longer have a Beit HaMikdash. V'lo shkalim, we have no shkalim. Collect shkalim for what? To bring korbanot in a Beit HaMikdash that doesn't exist physically? Bring physical shkalim for a spiritual Beis HaMikdash? The Beis HaMikdash is here with us on a spiritual level, but we can give spiritual shkalim maybe. We do that in our services, in our davening. As we know, our rabbis teach that the prayers after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed rose to fresh prominence, and now they took the place of the korbanot. But that doesn't require shkalim. That requires time and effort. Open a siddur and daven Shmoneh Esrei. And then you're doing like a korban. You don't have to collect for that. So the Sefer HaChinuch says, nonetheless, Nohagu Kol Yisrael. It is a custom amongst all the Jewish people, a ubiquitous custom. L'zecher hadavar, as a remembrance, so that we would bring this to mind and remember that this was a special time of the year for our ancestors. Likreis bebeis haknesses b'chol shana v'shana, to read as we gather in the synagogue each and every single year, Parsha zu shel Kitisa, this Parsha of Parshat Kitisa, which talks about the collection of the half shekels, until lechaper lekachtas kesef hakipurim, taking the money for atonement, b'Shabbat shehu lifnei Rosh Chodesh Adar leolam. Okay, so we have this idea. Why are we doing it today? As a zecher. And the truth is, there are many things which are called Zecher LeMikdash. We do these things as a memory. This is what was done in the Beis HaMikdash, so now we kind of have a Zecher LeMikdash. There are well-known Zecher LeMikdash, and then there's some not so well-known Zecher LeMikdash things. Things we do which everybody knows about, not even realizing that it's only done as a memory of the way things were in the Beis HaMikdash, and then things which are like customs that really very few people realize are connected to the Beis HaMikdash. I'll give you an example of something that is so ubiquitous, so well widely known, that people don't even realize it's only a Zecher LeMikdash. And that is the notion that in the festival of Sukkot, we take our lulav and our esrog, we take our 4 kinds all the days of the Yom Tov, with the exception of Shabbat. But if you open the Torah, it says, V'lakachtem lachem, you should take it by Yom HaRishon, only on the first day. So, why are we more religious than God? God told us to do it one day, we do it for 7 days. And the answer is that in the Beit HaMikdash we had a tradition that it should be taken for 7 days. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai made this injunction, Zecher LeMikdash, as a memory for the way things were in the Beit HaMikdash, that we too should take our lulav and esrog and make a bracha. It's a rabbinic injunction, fulfilling a rabbinic mitzvah. The first day is biblical, the subsequent days are rabbinic, and Zecher LeMikdash. The fact that we have 2 days of Yom Tov, when our calendar comes in the mail every year in September. Why do we have 2 days of Yom? Zecher LeMikdash, to remember a time the way it used to be. Although that really even outlived the Beis HaMikdash. And then we have like something which nobody even talks about, like the 2 challahs that we take on Shabbat, which are braided. And the braids make no sense. Why braid the challah? It doesn't really look braided afterwards. And if you want it to look nice on the outside, you could just put it into a form. You think about that? You work so hard, you braid the challah, it rises and bakes together, and it's just like a piece of bread inside. What was the point of doing all these strands of dough when in the end it's just a piece of bread? Well, the answer is that when you have 6 strands of dough in one hand and 6 strands of dough in the other, and they form 2 chalot, and you hold 2 chalot together, really and truly, how many strands of dough do you have? 12. And how many showbreads were there in the Beit HaMikdash? 12. So we're actually bringing to mind the showbread of the Beis HaMikdash, which was the service of placing and taking, that used to take place weekly on Shabbat morning. This is an example of something. There are many things we do Zecher LeMikdash. So therefore the custom of reading Parshat Shekel, Shabbos Shekalim, Parshat Shekalim, Zecher LeMikdash. However, even though it seems that this is only Zecher LeMikdash, and it's clearly well documented in Jewish history. I shared with you the words of the Gemara, but this is you can look in the Rambam. The Rambam brings down a halacha going back like 8 centuries ago. Rosh Chodesh Choli is b'Shabbos. Rambam is written many years after the Gemara, right? This is modern, written for our time, and he says Koydim b'Parshat Shekalim. You have to read Parshat Shekalim. You have the student of Rashi who wrote something called the Machzor Vitri, which is like an arrangement of what happens in synagogue, like a synagogue handbook. It's like a synagogue Shulchan Aruch, before there was a Shulchan Aruch. And he says, Rosh Chodesh Cholis b'Shabbos, Koydim Parshat Shekalim. You read Parshat Shekalim. And he gives instructions. He says, if it's Rosh Chodesh, you take a 3 Torahs. If it's not Rosh Chodesh, take a 2 Torahs. Straight up instructions. And this is how the Shulchan Aruch reads in the Torah, in the Shulchan Aruch. Rosh Chodesh Adar Hasamach LeNisan Siman Tafresh Behei, which is chapter 685. That's towards the end of Orach Chaim. It says that the Rosh Chodesh Adar that falls on Shabbos, Koydim Parshat Shekalim. And he tells you what that means, and what we have a half Torah, how many Torahs we take out. This is what we do. We do it. Zeichel HaMikdash. The Levush, Mordechai Yafe, who wrote a codification similar to the Shulchan Aruch, he says something very interesting. He says that this is not as an act of remembering only the Beis HaMikdash, but rather this becomes an act of uneshalmo parim sfasenu. So there's this pasuk that says that our lips pay the service of bullocks. That is to say, that when we cannot actually bring a korban, what takes the place of bringing the actual physical korban? The answer is our words, our prayers, our reading from the Torah. This is the concept of the Torah readings and the Musaf prayer. And in some way, that's how we bring a korban today. When we read the verses from the Torah, it's as if we're bringing the korban, it's the best we can do. It's not different than, the people who lost a grandparent, lost a parent, and you want their grandchildren to know about their grandparents. So, today you can see videos, but once upon a time there was no videos. What did they do? They talked about it. And sometimes you talk about somebody so much, you feel like you know the person, even if you never saw the person. So many stories, so much discussion, that it becomes real. In Hashem's eyes, when we read from the Torah, it becomes real. We have this fascinating medrash that says that when Jewish people will gather on the anniversary of giving of the Torah, and they'll read from the Torah, I'm giving you the Torah all over again. So we have this idea, reading from the Torah is a very powerful and profound experience. So when we read the verses that speak of the korban, that's the way we bring the korban today. In other words, according to the Levush, this is not merely a zecher, this in fact is an actualization. The actualization that's available for us. We can't give the shkalim, but we can read from a Torah about the shkalim.
Is that the same thing in the Siddur? With the offering?
It's similar to what we do in the Siddur, but it has a different weight when it's done from a Sefer Torah. We don't just take out a Sefer Torah. Taking out a Sefer Torah, it's part of the service. Blessings are recited over it. You can't just do these things arbitrarily. So therefore, it has meaning. It's not just a remembrance, it actually has meaning. Now, I want to share with you something very interesting. It seems to me that these two shittas, these two ideas, can actually be traced back to something fascinating about the shekels and the month of Adar. So the month of Adar was always shekel-oriented, from the very beginning. 30 days before, we had to prepare shekalim. But the Gemara says, when Haman launched his plan against the Jewish people, so the Gemara in Megillah on page 13 says that Haman finished his arguments, his closing argument, with a payoff. And he said to the king, Im ala melech toiv, after he made his whole case why Jewish genocide was a really good idea, and there would be no great loss to anybody. And he said, Im ala melech toiv yikasev la'adam, then the king shall make a decree to get rid of them. And I give you 10,000 kikar of silver. In case there's any damage, in case the coffers are in any way compromised, I take care of the royal coffers. I'll pay the damage and difference myself. Unfortunately, the king didn't even want to take the money. The Gemara says, the king said, keep your money, it's fine. I'm happy to get rid of the Jews anyway. It's just fine. But this is what Haman wanted to do. So the Gemara says, Amar Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish says, it was of course known to he who spoke and brought the world into existence, that Haman was going to come forward and offer shekels. He was going to pay for our lives and then take them. And because this was a very serious situation, lefikach higdim shekleihem lishkolov. The shekels of the Jewish people preempted the shekels of Haman. This is similar to what the Gemara says before. The Gemara says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu magdim refulah makah. God always prepares the solution before the disaster unfolds. In other words, Hashem arranged everything. So we had the possibility of being shielded by a mitzvah. Of course, we had to do tshuva. We had to actualize or download that software, that protection, but it was available for us. How? What created it? That was the result of our shekels. Now the Maharsha says, which shekels are these? He says, this is the shekels that were given in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Maharsha makes a calculation that if you figure out how many half shekels the Jewish people gave, 600,000 half shekels, it comes out to 10,000 kikar. Exactly the amount that Haman was offering. So in that case, this is clearly the shekels that were offered in the time of the Beis HaMikdash. The Mishkan, the first shekels that were offered. And it was the shekels that had been given thousands of years earlier, or some 13 centuries earlier, or 12 centuries earlier, that in the end saved the Jewish people. However, there is another way to understand all of this. There's a lot of discussion about this, what it means, whether it's the shekels they gave, why were they giving shekels? Some want to maintain they were collecting shekels because they believed the Beis HaMikdash's rebuilding was imminent. And there was an act of faith, they started collecting shekels. And when did this happen? Was it the first year, the second? There's a whole discussion about this. But I found fascinating thing the Chassam Sofer says. He says, you know what? The truth is, they didn't give half shekels. It's not about what they gave. Rather, this refers to the reading of Machatzis Hashekel, Parshat Shekalim. So number one, the Chassam Sofer clearly believes that the reading of Parshat Shekalim not only was during the Second Temple era, but prior to the Second Temple era, they were already reading Parshat Shekalim. And he says this was done on the Shabbos before Rosh Chodesh, so that served as protection for the Jewish people. Now, if you're going to say that the idea of speaking actually created a protective aura for the Jewish people, I don't know, to me, this seems to be what the Levush is saying. It's not just a memory. It's not just a zecher. This is an Neshama Parnas Faseinu. We gave the shekels. Well, we didn't give the shekels. Well, we read about the shekels. And reading about the shekalim is like giving shekalim. It's interesting. Other commentaries point that Haman never gave the shekels either. He also just talked a fast game. He said, I'm ready to give you the shekels. And in the end, Achashverosh didn't take the shekels. So it was like, speech against speech. But more importantly, he was ready to give his shekels. Haman was ready to do it. The fact that we read Parshat Shekalim was meaningful. And this is a very profound expression of how meaningful it was, that this served to protect us. So when you talk about coming to Shul and hearing Parshat Shekalim, it's a big deal. This saved us. It was the reading of Parshat Shekalim that actually served as the counterweight to Haman's shekels.
Reading it, when was that time?
When would it have been read?
Yeah.
On Rosh Chodesh Adar.
After the temple.
After the temple. So the temple wasn't around. We're talking at the end of the 70 years after the first temple had been destroyed. Second Beit HaMikdash had not yet been built, even though many Jewish people were already living back in Eretz Yisrael, as Nachmanides Ramban talks about in his preface to his commentary on Masechet Megillah. So many people were living there, but still they weren't collecting half shekels. The Beit HaMikdash wasn't functioning. But they were reading Parshat Shekalim. And this, seems to me, is kind of a proof for the words of the Levush. So we have these two schools of thought which seem to jibe even in the idea of the shekels of Haman. How did it work? Was it the giving of shekels that had happened prior, going all the way back even to Moshe Rabbeinu? Or was it the reading of Parshat Shekalim? Chassam Sofer says the reading of Parshat Shekalim. Now, of course, you can say, what's the difference? What difference does it make? There is a difference. Rabbi Tzvi Pesach Frank, who was the rabbi of Yerushalayim for many years, a great Goren, he has a phenomenal suggestion. He says there is actually a halachic difference. And this is a very practical halachic difference. Many people do not realize that a bar mitzvah boy is not really a major, at least not biblically. According to the Torah, you have to be of 13 years of age and you have to have reached puberty. So some bar mitzvah boys are actually biblically bar mitzvah, and some bar mitzvah boys are only rabbinically bar mitzvah, which means they do mitzvahs, but they don't really have the full obligation of mitzvahs. And so, there's the discussion in Achronim, can you give a young person this aliyah? Can you have him make the bracha? And some say, well, there's 4 readings. Some of these readings are biblical. Some of these are not possibly biblical. That shouldn't be given to a child, because some have it in some communities they give mafta to a child, even somebody who's 12. But he says, what about having him read it? So there seems to be a machlekes, a dispute amongst the later sages, whether or not a bar mitzvah boy should read Parshat Shekalim. And this is extremely practical, because it oftentimes happens that a bar mitzvah boy has a bar mitzvah. And what do most bar mitzvah boys in our community read? Parshat Shekalim. So the question is this. He says, if Parshat Shekalim in today's day and age is only a zecher, a remembrance of the concept of the kriya, of the reading of Parshat Shekalim in the Mikdash, so then the halachic definition of this reading is a broadcast. It's a proverbial tweet. It's a posting. You're getting a message out. And you're getting a message out as a memory. We used to make this broadcast. We're making this broadcast now. So he said, what's the difference? Who makes the broadcast? So he's not yet a biblical bar mitzvah boy. So he's a rabbinic bar mitzvah boy. Who cares? The point is we should remember. And when the Torah is being read, we remember. We remember that a new year is coming. A new start is about to unfold before us. That in the time of the Beit HaMikdash for our ancestors, this was a major date on the calendar. It represented a new annual cycle of Beit HaMikdash offerings. And because of this, it's important, very important. So we're remembering it. So if somebody who's bar mitzvah or midrabanan reminds you, nish geferlich, he says, that works. That can suffice or satisfy that halachic need. However, he suggests, if you follow the approach that is stringent, he says that would jibe with the words of the Levush. Why? Because if it's a question of unashalma podem sfasenu, if you're actually accomplishing something, which means there's an obligation upon us, we, the Jewish people, are obligated to fulfill this mitzvah. It's one of the biblical mitzvahs of giving a half shekel. Can we give a half shekel today? The answer is no. We do give a half shekel as a custom on Erev Purim. It kind of is connected to the Gemara and the fact that people used to give half shekels on Adar. But we're not giving a half shekel. You're not even allowed to give it as a half shekel because then you wouldn't be able to use it. We give tzedakah. We give a half shekel, a half silver dollar of wherever place we live in as a zecher. That's certainly not a reenactment, because if it was a reenactment, we'd have problems. You wouldn't be able to use that money. It'd have to be used for korbanos. So the question is, how do we fulfill this mitzvah today? And some would say, well, we don't. And the Levush would say, well, we kind of do. How so? By reading about it from the Torah. Our lips are serving in lieu of the actions, because we don't have the ability to do the actions. Says the P'tiv Pesach, he says Mikra Kodesh. If so, if you're actually doing something, so then that can't be done by somebody who's not technically obligated. And the bar mitzvah boy, who hasn't yet reached puberty, isn't technically obligated in mitzvahs yet. And because of that, he should not be reading this just Torah for everybody, but instead it should be read by somebody who is a major, somebody who is actually considered what we call in halacha a gadol. So it's very interesting that the different levels of jurisprudence actually have a practical difference in who should or shouldn't read. And ideally, the person reading Parshat Shekalim should be a major. And we see that this business of reading Parshat Shekalim is not a joke. The Chassam Sofer maintains that it in fact served to save our people from the machinations, the designs of Haman Yimach Shema.
Why is it then isolated just to Shekalim, Parshat Shekalim, not every weekly Parsha?
So a little bit you came late, but the idea is that we talked about it earlier, that the notion of reading the Torah reading concept, was something that was instituted in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, but which parsha you would read each week was something that didn't really become solidified until many, many, many years later. After the period of the Mishnah, after the period of the Gemara.
Oh, so you're saying the actual...
So
Sedra,
the actual Sedra is only something that was solidified during the time of the Gaonim.
So therefore...
After that, yeah.
Okay, sure.
So therefore, the exact reading of what you read is not so simple. And let me tell you a little secret. There are chunks of time when in Eretz Yisrael they're reading one parsha, right, and we outside of Israel are reading a different parsha.
Sure.
We were actually on not only different pages, different chapters,
right,
different, like sometimes almost like a different book, right? So what's the real parsha Shavua? Well, it depends where you live. Depends who you are. And what do you do if you come to Israel and you're going back home? Like, how you going to hear that parsha? Like, the issues.
The reason we do this parsha is that it takes the place of the actual giving of the...
According to the Levush, it takes the place of the actual giving of the Shekalim, which makes it a really big deal, really serious. I mean, Zeichel HaMikdash is not a small thing. Remembering the Beis HaMikdash is an important part of our Judaism. But according to the Levush, we're actually doing our shekel mitzvah by listening to Parshat Shekalim. And I want to conclude with understanding the message of Parshat Shekalim on a spiritual level. Because ultimately, if we're kind of launching a new year, and this is like a beginning, just like we understand the month of Elul has all these spiritual preparations for a new beginning, this should have more than just the fulfillment of one mitzvah. Isn't there something more to it? So, in order to understand how there might be something more to it, let me share with you a fascinating rumination from our Rebbe about the mitzvah of Machatzis Hashekel, where he points out that there seems to be an inherent contradiction in the way this mitzvah is done between the object and the subject. This means, in jurisprudence, in Lumdus language, between the gavra and the chefza. The gavra is Aramaic for the person, and the chefza means the object with which the mitzvah is being done. There are some mitzvahs which are incumbent on us as individuals. It's not about the object, it's about us doing our part. There are other mitzvahs which are about the object. And I'll give you a simple example. Eating or not eating milk and meat is a responsibility we have, but it actually speaks about an object. Don't eat that. There's an object here, a definitive object, the cheeseburger, don't eat it. Waiting 6 hours between milk and meat does not have an object that it addresses. You shouldn't eat one after the other, but there isn't an actual object of something which is not kosher. I shouldn't eat between, I should make sure there's time spent between one and the other so it can properly digest, so that it's not between my teeth anymore, and so on and so forth. The difference in the person and the object. So when it comes to this mitzvah, the object of the mitzvah, what do you do? Or what's used for this mitzvah? You know, mitzvah of matzah, you need a matzah. Mitzvah of lulav and esrog, you need a lulav. What do you need here? You need a half a shekel. A half a shekel. And if you remember a few weeks ago, I talked about the idea that originally the half a shekel wasn't just a coin that said half a shekel. It was actually a half a shekel. Like a chopped coin.
But this isn't the same shekel we were talking about last week. The same half.
It is the same half shekel, same idea.
I thought one of them was used to making of the Mishkan, and the other was
There
used
was
for...
very good. Yeah, the half shekel in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, there was 2 half shekels. One was used to make the sockets, the foundation of the Mishkan, and the other was used for the offerings. We're going to get to that in a minute. But later, subsequent in the first temple, according to Ramban and many others, they didn't have a half shekel. They were actually cutting a shekel, as I explained in the Shekel Secrets class. So the object is broken to piece. But what about the giving? So the giving has to be complete. Because the Rambam says the halacha is there are many responsibilities that can be paid out slowly. When it comes to this mitzvah, you cannot pay it out incrementally. You have to give the whole amount immediately. And that seems to be an inherent contradiction. On one hand, we emphasize a broken, a jagged, a piece. On the other hand, we emphasize wholesomeness, the whole thing, at once. And it seems to be almost like a contradiction. And the answer, as we explained in that class, is because the Machatzis Hashekel represents the fact that we come to an awareness that we are incomplete without God. It's not that we have a complete, full life. Allow God into my life a little too. I'll compartmentalize. God will be a part, a hobby, a pastime, something I do. Now the message of the Machatzis Hashekel is that without God, I am not. The question is to be or not to be, and without God, I can't be. I'm but a half. And that has to be wholehearted. The awareness that we're but a half is a wholehearted kind of thing. You cannot be, well, I'm halfway buying into the idea that I'm a half. So the object is a half a shekel, because the object is that you should know you're but a half. The way it's given is entire, absolute, wholehearted. The Rebbe says this helps us understand how we inaugurate this month of preparation for a new season. What's the first thing we do? The first thing we do is we demonstrate that we are but a half without HaKadosh Baruch Hu. and that is our wholehearted commitment. So every single year, as we prepare for a new cycle of offerings in the Beis HaMikdash, which Korban means kiruv, means closeness. And the whole idea of Beis HaMikdash is the mechanism through which God's presence is able to come into our lives through the korbanot that are brought. And how do we prepare for that every year? Well, the first thing we do is read Parshat Shekalim, in which we are actively and animating the concept and the awareness that we are but a half. Now, which means that on Parshat Shekalim, you shouldn't just listen to the Parsha being read. You should kind of live with the spirit of Parshat Shekalim. Parshat Shekalim is an annual reminder for us that every single year, come Rosh Chodesh Adar, or right before it, it's time for us to stop, to think, and remember that in truth, the way we look at life, the way we look at HaKadosh Baruch Hu is that God completes us. We are only a half of that HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this gives us an appreciation of how we begin this preparation with renewed commitment and dedication to the Almighty. And the Rebbe said furthermore, the idea of Machatzis Hashekel, broadly speaking, is the concept of tzedakah. And of course, we actually give a Machatzis Hashekel these days, and it's actual tzedakah, not a korban. It actually goes to the needy or to supporting Torah institutions. So Parshat Shekalim, there's this idea of a mitzvah that we always do. It's not one mitzvah. It's a concept which is always found in our Yiddishkeit. Tzedakah is something that a Jew is supposed to do on a daily basis. It's a feature in all Jewish homes, having a tzedakah box, a pushka. That people put something in the pushka every single day. That the act of giving on a daily basis makes a difference in our lives. And because this is something which is so ongoing and regular, it makes sense that that's how we herald a new beginning, with a recommitment to the ideal of tzedakah. And the Rebbe says that tzedakah is overarchingly important on two levels. On one level, the concept of tzedakah represents the notion of creation itself. Everything God gives us is actually tzedakah. As one wise person says, we complain about schnorrers, but fundraisers, but every single day we stand before God like a schnorrer. We say, gimme, gimme, gimme. Give me this, give me that. We just have a whole long litany of things we ask by virtue of what? Gimme. We have our hand out. And the truth is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world Olam Chesed Yibana. God created the world with kindness. He gave us kindness. He gave us a life. He gave us bodies that work, that function. We have so many gifts in our life. It's a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's a tzedakah. And so, really, in a certain sense, when we're charitable to others, what we do in turn is bring forth God's charity to us. Kol marachim, anybody who shows mercy, marachim im alav. Hashem has mercy subsequently to him. So there are two elements over here. There's an element of kind of making up for things that are missing, fulfilling needs. And then there's this overarching element that everything we have is tzedakah from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And here, as to your point, in the Machatzis Hashekel, there were 2 points. Two Machatzis Hashekel originally. One was the foundation, and the other was the korbanot. The korbanot come in principle as a kapara, as an atonement. It comes to make up for shortcomings. The foundation represents the foundation of life itself. The foundation is not about a shortcoming. The foundation, the Machatzis Hashekel, is foundationally emphasizes the notion of tzedakah. And last but not least, the Rebbe pointed out that the half shekel not only reminds us that we are but a half without HaKadosh Baruch Hu, without God in our lives, but it also reminds us that we all need each other. And we all have to come together. Everybody brings his or her little half, right? We all make our contribution. And when all of us give a piece, a part, so the grand collection serves then to bring about korbanot, offerings, or atonement for the Jewish people. And that is to say that Parshat Shekalim, the way we prepare for a new cycle every year, is with an emphasis on the importance of community and unity, of us being together. And the truth is that oftentimes Parshat Shekalim falls right around Parshat Vayakhel, like this year. And Parshat Vayakhel means Moses congregated. So the emphasis on congregating, the emphasis on us doing all of this together. And therefore, we have this annual renewal in which each and every one of us has to realize that we are but members of a larger community. We are but individuals who together comprise a great nation. And when we realize that we are but a half and we need each other, and all of us together realize that everybody is incomplete without the presence of Hashem in your life, then we have begun to prepare for an annual new season of korban, of kiruv, of closeness to Hashem. And we hope and we pray that Emir Hashem this year not only will read Parshat Shekalim, not only it'll be a Neshalma Parim, we'll be fulfilling it through reading, not only will we be remembering what once used to happen, but in fact, Bezrat Hashem, that this year we'll have the privilege of giving a Machatzis Hashekel and seeing the korbanot brought in the third Beit HaMikdash, B'mheira, will be Ameinu, Amen.
Amen.